I want you all to help me understand the process. Okay, I've run a small business, but I've never done any government contracting. Let's say that I'm one of these 8A organizations. I'll come back to that in some more detail later. But let's say that I'm on one of these no-bid contracts. Walk me through the process. Either Ms. Kendall, I think this is to begin with Mr. Jordan, on how I get the contract briefly, but then more importantly, how you make sure that I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing, both in terms of me as a contractor and then my relationship with my subcontractors.
Sure. So your first step in the 8A context would be application and certification in this business development program. So now you're in the program and you want to compete for contracts. In the sole source context that you talked about, the agency would identify a contract that, they had a particular need, they were going to contract out, and it was suitable for the 8A program. They did their market research. They knew there were 8A firms out there. It was the best small business program to use. So they would contact a district office, or maybe they knew about it. There are multiple ways that this can happen, but they could talk to the district office and say, hey, we know you have an 8A portfolio with various firms here, or we know that this firm can do it, what have you. The district office, the SBA district office would then evaluate, hey, can this firm, does it have the capacity, does it jive with their business development plan that they've submitted to us? Yes, it does. Okay, that contract can go forward. And the agency would then award on a sole source basis, assuming it's within the various limits, this contract to that firm. So over the period of that contract term, every year it has an annual review with SBA as a firm, not just on that contract, but on everything they're doing. How are they improving against their business plan? Are they achieving their targeted objectives? All of those types of things, one of which would be looking at what contracts are they performing against. Then in terms of subcontracting out, in that contract that they had entered into, it would have limitations on subcontracting. So, if it's a services contract, it would say that small business, because this was a set-aside, has to perform at least 50% of the labor costs with its own labor.
Let me stop you there.
Please.
Some of the things that I read say that I'm supposed to be able I wouldn't know how to allocate that in my business. We didn't use the cost accounting system. So tell me how we get around that hurdle. How do I satisfy that requirement, that 50% requirement?
So we talk a lot about when we're engaging with small businesses and getting them up to speed to sell to the government about being contract ready. That's a phrase that you hear a lot. And what that means is a lot of things, but one of which is you have to have all of the systems in place, approved systems in place to do business with the government. So it's very clear what the responsibilities are for the agency in terms of oversight and in terms of the small business to make sure that they can prove that. So because at any time, it's a clause in the contract. The contracting officer can say, show me the documentation that says you're in compliance.
Let me ask a quick question, Ms. Kendall, because Ms. Chu was asking an interesting line of questions about the examples that one example you gave where there was no subcontracting language in the contract. And she asked if there was a standard procedure. And I guess she's asking it, what I'm asking in a different way is there not a standard contract? Is it pre-printed, or is this written from scratch every single time that Mr. Jordan just described it gets let?
I'm going to have to defer to Mr. Jordan on that one. I truly don't know the answer
Okay,
to that.
that's fine.
There are some differences where clauses get inserted or taken out or whatever, but in the set-aside context, even if, the example that Ms. Chu raised earlier had happened, and if Ms. Kendall's supposition proved to be correct that it was contracting officer error, not including that, we don't care. The fact that it was a small business set-aside means that limitation on subcontracting requirement is part of that contract. Whether or not the contracting officer forgot to include that or didn't cut and paste correctly does not matter in terms of the law. You still have to abide by the limitations of subcontracting because it's a set-aside, and all small business set-asides must.
I will stop you again, Mr. I got news for you. You and I sign a contract for me to do something, and it's not in the contract. I'm pretty certain I don't have to do it.
So our position has always been, for all small business set-asides, the regulations are very clear that the limitations on subcontracting exist. So whether or not they had included that, it is applicable to that small business set-aside.
And the staff tells me that may be the case. It's something unique to small business contracting. So, again,
I'm not a lawyer.
Shows you what my law degree is worth. All right, so now we're in this process. You've signed the contract with me. I'm an 8A provider. I've got this contract. It's under $6.5 million. I'm not an Alaska native. How often do you come to make sure I'm in compliance, and how often do I have to show to you, prove to you that I'm in compliance?
So for the contracting officer, who's really monitoring
He's
that
an agency,
contract,
right?
yeah, they can do it periodically. They can add, if they have any reason to believe you're not in compliance, and then typically it's semi-annually or annually that they would check. Now, if it's a firm fixed price, sole source contract in this case, then the contractor, the 8A firm, you would have to show that you have a plan that you're going to meet the limitations of subcontracting for that whole contract. And so if you dip below the 50%, but you're saying, yeah, we know, but here's why at the end we're going to be back above it, then that can be acceptable. If it's an IDIQ, one of those indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts, where you don't know exactly how much money you're going to get over the life of that contract, you're supposed to always be above the limitation on subcontracting.
Okay. I've got this contract. I said, listen, it's going to be $4.5 million. You've looked at it and say, okay, it's going to be $4.5 million. And it's not. It's $2.5 million, really. And what I've done is I've inflated the value of this deal by $2 million. And you see where I'm going in this. I'm not going to ask you specifics about the case that's ongoing. I'm not going to ask you specifics about an ongoing investigation. But let's say that I did that. Let's say that I did exactly what these gentlemen are accused of doing. And instead of giving you a number of $2.5 million, I told you it was $4.5 million. And you said, okay, that makes sense. Where are you going to catch? How are you going to catch my fraud in this process?
There are multiple ways in which these frauds can be caught. Does it become challenging in a generic situation where you have a contracting officer, a representative of the prime contractor, and a representative of the subcontractor all in a hypothetical sense engaging in fraudulent activity? Yes. But that's why there are so many different points at which people are checking this.
But even if the contracting officer is not part of this deal, okay, maybe he just thought that $4.5 million was a reasonable number. Isn't one of the standards he has to be able to establish that the government is being harmed by what he sees? Let me find the research. Hang on a second. There's a list of reasons that, where was it, Emma? It's in the memo. Yeah. Contracting officers need to prove that the pass-through of the work harmed the government before most agencies take action against the companies. However, if I'm delivering exactly what I promised to deliver, how does he meet that threshold? How does he prove that I'm in non-compliance?
So it depends on exactly what is going on. If it was just a case of inflated pricing or things of that nature, the government before the contract should or may have come up with a independent government estimate on what they expected to cost, and if they expected it to be that inflated price, and it was, then that would be more difficult to prove. If it was coming in above what they thought, they would ask a lot of questions and ask for documentation and ask for proof, and that's why you've seen the Office of Federal Procurement Policy push agencies to go more towards these firm fixed price contracts, because when you are all in agreement at the outset of what this is going to cost for you to provide me the goods or services that I've asked for, then it's harder to play those games with inflated costs and try and hide that. Now, the contracting officer would look at these limitations of subcontracting. So how much is the prime actually performing? So is it the sub who's inflating costs because then getting passed back through the prime? Well, that's going to hurt that limitation because the subcontracting dollars will go up. The amount the percentage the prime is doing would go down, and again, that would have to stay above 50%. So those are some of the ways. And then in the 8A context, you're going to have an annual review, and we're going to be talking with you and your firm to make sure you're operating within the business plan. There's a whole host of checks we do too.
And I guess it strikes me that my example of inflating a $2.5 million contract, a $4.5 million contract, might raise some red flags because it's a relatively large percentage. But when you get to the larger contracts, especially ones with the Alaska Native companies, the potential for fraud would grow, wouldn't it? Because the difference between a $2.5 million and $4.5 million contract is a relatively sizable chunk. The difference between a $100 million contract and a $102 million contract wouldn't stand out as much, would it?
Certainly, the percentage difference based on the overcharging in that larger example is less, but the size of the contract would probably indicate that there's more attention being paid to it by the agency overall. And there's two pieces to your question, really, or to my answer to your question. One is the surveillance and monitoring, so making sure that folks at the agency, and when SBA does surveillance reviews and compliance reviews and these types of things, are looking for this type of behavior, and then making sure the enforcement is there to not just punish the bad actors we catch, but disincentivize anybody from trying. So there are some new proposed regulations that will go out, and I've talked about them in terms of the Jobs Act statute that created them around presumption of loss. So in the past, and this is where that harm to the government piece really came in the past, if you misrepresented your size or status to win an award, we would suspend, debar, maybe pursue a False Claims Act action against you through the Department of Justice. But it was hard, if the government got exactly what we wanted for a fair price, for us to go after you significantly because you lied about being a service-disabled vet. It's really that second place finisher, the true wounded warrior who should have gotten that contract that was harmed. Well, now it doesn't matter. That stuff doesn't matter. The law clearly states if you lie about your size or status to win an award, we can sue you civilly for the full amount of that award and keep what you provided and still do the suspensions and termination debarments.
And in the last 12 months, how many times have you all done those things?
Well, this presumption of loss is new, so it's still being stood up. In terms of the suspensions and debarments, we've stepped it up quite a bit. We've done more referrals for suspension and debarment have happened in the last 2 years than the previous 10 years. And I mentioned before the suspension tool, which I think is a really important tool because it's something where SBA can take action while we're waiting for an investigation to run its course, and we want due process to happen, and we want any accused parties to get a full investigation and due process. But we can take this suspension action. In 2008, there was 0. In 2009, there was 1. And then 6 in 2010, and then 15 this year. So we are stepping up the utilization of that tool when we think it's appropriate.
Does the use of that tool partially explain, I guess it can't fully explain, does it partially explain why no fines have ever been issued, the liquidated damages provision? I heard that in my opening comment, and I was actually reading the details during the break, and it's actually worse than I thought. It's in 30 years, there's no record of any company paying liquidated damages, ever.
So when I started 2.5 years ago, and we started to work on, or continued good work that was happening on getting small businesses more subcontracting opportunity, preventing some of this bait and switch, all these types of things that we just came out with some of the proposed regs on yesterday. That was one of the areas we pushed. Is the subcontracting plan is a material part of the contract. So if you're violating that, you are violating terms of the contract, and there's a whole host of actions, including liquidated damages. Well, the problem that I'm told by agencies is that you can drive a truck through what it means to make a good faith effort to meet the limitations on or meet the subcontracting plan requirements. We've now shored up through these new regs whose responsibility is, what some of the things that you should be looking for are, and what some of the penalties are. But you're right, that is, I've never heard of anybody actually using liquidated.
You want to come up with some suggestions on how to close those loopholes, and this committee will take up those things, because our research indicated the same thing, which is it's very difficult for you all to prove with the safe harbor provisions and the good faith requirements. And if we need to start closing some of those, let's get together and see if we can do that. I'm also, we'll take up probably another day. It's a relatively minor issue, I know, in terms of its footprint, but it seems like these Alaska Native companies are really where some more attention should be. Does the SBA have an official position on that policy as to why ANCs get special treatment?
Well,
should.
The provisions that allow those types of things are all statutory, part of the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act and follow-on amendments to that. So it's not something that SBA has a position on one way or the other. But what I will say is I'd point to the regulations that we came out with in March, where we really did, and we went around and did tribal consultations and talked to the community about how to get these right. But one of the key provisions in that comprehensive revision, the 8A regulations, deals with the joint ventures, and that was a place where some of the actions that were happening before really didn't pass the smell test, and we've tightened those quite a bit about when you form a joint venture between an 8A firm and a mentor, a larger business, what percentage of the work the 8A firm has to do, and what are some of the subcontracting rules there, and I am proud of what we did there to move as quickly as possible, but also thoughtfully to close any loopholes there.
All right. There was just a couple more questions. There was a Washington Post story about a year ago, and in that story it's pointed out that the SBA had been relying on 3 employees and paper records in Anchorage. I'm going to spend more time another day on these ANCs, but I want to ask this one question. That y'all were using 3 employees and paper records to track some of these companies, and there was $6 billion worth of sole source contracts. Tell me more about that.
Sure. So I have had the privilege of testifying in front of Congress.
By the way, that
times.
doesn't mean I believe everything that I read in the Washington.
No, that's
Sorry, they're here someplace.
No, yes. So I certainly welcome the conversation around native entities and the community benefits that they bestow versus the individual business development of the traditional individually owned 8A firms. When it comes to our operating and overseeing the program, our Inspector General raised some concerns, had 6 recommendations on things that we need to look at. Well, by the time I testified on that report, we'd already fixed 4, and we've subsequently fixed the other 2. We agreed and have taken care of increasing staffing, increasing training on how do you process and oversee the native entity applications, which are much different than when an individual applies or is in the 8A program, and what are the rules that govern the behavior that do fall within our regulatory authority.
Thank you, Ms. Jordan. Ms. Kendall, very, very briefly, come back to the US-2 issue. My understanding is that they had contracts of about $250 million, but were running out of a guy's house, essentially. How did y'all get involved? Help me understand the process as to where the Inspector General's office got involved in this investigation.
We got involved in 2 ways. We actually conducted. We were conducting a joint review with the Department of Defense, IG, which is mandated for them to do, but because it was Sierra Vista's contracting unit, we joined with them and found this contract and flagged it as a problem. We also...
What about the contract made you flag it?
I'm not sure I can tell you right now.
Fair enough.
But we also got a referral from one of the deputy assistant secretaries where they had identified this as a potential problem. So we looked at it both as a result of the audit where this came to light for reasons I will be glad to tell you later. But then we also, the entity itself identified a problem with this particular contract and asked us to take a look at it.
Is it fair to say that that would have been an inquiry within the agency that was initiated by the contracting officer?
I don't know if it was initiated by the contracting officer or someone in the chain of command, but somebody internal to Interior identified it.
And I guess my question is this: did it happen? Let's take your independent investigation off the table. I want to focus on the one that came from the deputy director. Did that happen by accident, or did it happen the way it's supposed to happen?
That I'm not sure.
Okay. All right, and then, so you got involved with it, and then what happened next? You're doing your independent investigation. You're also getting an inquiry from the agency itself.
Yes.
How did you come to find out that this was a problem?
We went in and looked at their records. We interviewed the contracting officer. We interviewed the entity. It was clear it was a problem on many levels, and I guess I feel like I maybe missed an opportunity with the Congresswoman when she asked a question about fixing, and I refer to Mr. Jordan's answer just a minute ago. I think on all fronts we could do better to look at the capacity of these companies. In this case, it was a company of 1 or 2 people. And I've only heard, I don't know for a fact, that it was run out of someone's living room. But previously, they had never done more than $100,000 a year in business. To suggest that they had the capacity to do 50% of a $250 million contract is...
Mr. Jordan, are you familiar with the US-2 situation?
I have read the Inspector General's report just in preparation for this conversation, but not in depth.
To the extent you can, then here's the question I'm hoping to get an answer to. Why were they allowed to get as far as they did? Why was a company that had never done more than a couple $100,000 worth of contract end up with such a huge chunk? What part of the process broke down to where that company could get as far along as they did?
I'm not familiar enough with this case to speculate as to exactly where it broke down.
Well, and I'm not pointing fingers certainly at SBA. I think that the Sierra Vista contracting folks should have asked the question themselves. But it's...
Is that not part of the standard procedure, though? I mean, isn't there a form that says, have you ever done any other government contracting? If so, how big were they?
There is past performance that a company who wants to do business with the government, it attaches to their application. I'm not familiar enough with the entire process to say that it's a part of a process or not, but it seems to me that it's a practical thing that somebody would want to ask the question or would look at the capacity of a company to say, not sure that they could do this.
I recognize you're not familiar with this exact situation, but that's got to be part of the past performance, isn't it?
Yeah, the contracting officer will make what's called a responsibility determination that this prime contractor is responsible, is capable of performing on the contract and abiding by all of the clauses. And in the 8A context, it is a business development program, so we want them to grow and that sort of thing. But so SBA will look at that and agree with them. But in this specific case, I'm not sure.
Thank you all very much. Mr. Jordan, I'm serious about those suggestions. If the SBA wants to start looking at a way to close some of those good faith, safe harbor loopholes, it's certainly something that this subcommittee would be interested in taking up in the upcoming year. So, Ms. Kendall, thank you very much. I understand you have another time commitment. Thank you all both. We'll go ahead and seat the second panel now and move through that as quickly as we can.
Thank you.